Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today, we are going to be going through the discography of Talking Heads. Talking Heads are undeniably one of the most important bands of the late 70s and 80s, with their incredibly unique music that created this great fusion of new wave, funk, art rock, post-punk, and Afrobeat. Their discography is filled with so much great music that is very refreshing and really sets them apart from the majority of other bands that were around during their time. And for me personally, they are definitely one of the top bands that contributed some of the strongest albums of that period from the late 70s into the 80s. So a very fun episode for today. And what I'm going to do is go through their 8 studio albums, starting with Talking Heads 77 and going up to Naked. I'm not going to be including live albums on this, so we won't be including Stop Making Sense, but I'll go through their 8 studio albums and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1977 titled Talking Heads 77, and I will give this one an S. I absolutely love this album, and this is actually my second favorite Talking Heads record, which might surprise some people. Stylistically, I love the direction that they started out with this art rock, new wave, dance, and punk sort of hybrid, which creates a great adventurous variety from track to track. From beginning to end, I think all of the songs on here are very enjoyable, with a lot of really great high points and standout moments. As a guitar player, I particularly love the guitar work throughout this record. I would say of all of the Talking Heads albums, I actually think this one probably has the strongest and most adventurous guitar work of any of their releases. We have some very colorful and unorthodox chord movements on tracks like Happy Day, No Compassion, The Book I Read, and Don't Worry About the Government. We have the groovy feel-good dance flavors on tracks like New Feeling, Who Is It, and Pulled Up. And of course we have their first hit song in Europe and the United States with Psycho Killer, which is probably the song Talking Heads is most well known for. A Talking Heads classic and definitely one of the highlights of this album. My other favorite tracks on here would be No Compassion, Happy Day, and The Book I Read. The only critique that I hear about this album that I do agree with is the production not being as strong as it was on albums that were to follow it. And I do think that is true, but also I don't think the production is bad. And for the stylistic choices that they were making with these songs, I think the production worked out just fine. But obviously when Brian Eno comes into the picture, the production does reach new levels that weren't present on this record. So I do understand that critique, but I don't think it takes away from the album very much. And I think it's a very good first album, and music that was clearly very different and ahead of its time for 1977, really setting up a great launching pad for future albums and continued evolution and experimentation of their sound and style. And I would regard a couple of tracks on here as some of my favorite Talking Heads songs. So a very good record to start out on. My second favorite Talking Heads album. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1978 titled More Songs About Buildings and Food, and I'm going to give this one an A. Of all of the albums on this list, this was the one that I struggled with the most. I really had to think about it, and it was right on the cusp of getting an S, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like it was fitting to be an A tier. This was the first of 3 records to be produced by Brian Eno, whom they met on tour in 1977, and I think it's pretty undeniable that his addition to the writing and recording process of Talking Heads was a very good thing. And this album went into a more funky and dancey sort of direction with less art rock elements than the previous release, and they produce a lot of really amazing tracks on here, lots of really tasty grooves and feel-good vibes. But there is a part of me that does miss a little bit of what they were doing on the first release with the more experimental and artsy tracks. But regardless of that, this is still a very enjoyable album. I will say there are a couple of tracks on here that I've never been super crazy about, and that is one of the other reasons as to why I put it in A tier. Believe it or not, the opening 2 tracks are probably my least favorite part of this album, with Thank You for Sending Me an Angel and With Our Love. For some reason, no matter how many times I listen to those 2 songs, they just never grow on me, but I do think the remainder of the album is very strong, in particular from tracks 3 to 7, which I would say is the peak of the album, and we also have a cover song on here of Al Green's Take Me to the River, which was their first top 30 US hit. And while I do enjoy this cover, I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite covers of all time. I know some people really love it, but I can get bored of it after a while, and it's not a song that I revisit very often, but that's just a preference on my part. But I would say the majority of this album is very enjoyable with really strong tracks. My personal favorites being The Girls Want to Be with the Girls, Stay Hungry, and The Good Thing. So a slight downgrade from the first release in my opinion, but still very good nonetheless, with an improvement in production with the addition of Brian Eno, and a nice stylistic shift from the first release, which shows them continuing to expand their sound and venture into more and more groovy and dancey territories. So a very good album. This one will get an A. Okay, moving on, we have their third studio album from 1979 titled Fear of Music, and this one will get an S. Absolutely amazing record, and this one would go down as my third favorite Talking Heads album. I really love the direction that they decided to go in for this one, doing a lot more experimenting from a songwriting standpoint, and the general mood of this album does take on more of a darker tone, which I always love to hear. They had also started exploring African music at this point, with Fela Kuti being a big influence, and this is their first album where we hear some of those Afrobeat flavors coming in particular with the opening track, I Zimbra, which was one of 3 singles on here. The remainder of the album captures that perfect blend of funk, new wave, and art rock. Production-wise, we have Brian Eno stretching out even more and really adding so many amazing sounds and textures to these tracks, and even co-writing a couple of songs. Musically, there's a lot of fascinating things going on within these tracks. For me, one particular groove that always amazed me is the opening vocal section to the track Mind. If you listen to the bass line, vocal melody, and guitar and keyboard part, it sounds like there are 3 different keys happening at the same time, which creates this really fascinating sound, and I absolutely love moments like that, and I think this album is filled with stuff like that. This would also spawn their most popular hit up to this point with Life During Wartime, which is another amazing and classic Talking Heads track. For me, my personal favorite tracks on here are Mind, Air, Heaven, and Cities. I also love the closing track, Drugs. That one has the flavors of Brian Eno all over it, and a super cool and vibey song to wrap up this amazing album with, and really highlights the magical pairing of David Byrne and Brian Eno. So an amazing album, in my opinion, an improvement upon their second release, and like I said, this one goes down as my third favorite Talking Heads album. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their fourth studio album from 1980 titled Remain in Light, and obviously this one is going to get an S. No surprises here, and this one goes down as my number 1 favorite Talking Heads album. I know it's such a cliche choice, but I definitely think this album deserves all of the praise that it gets. It's just absolutely incredible. From front to back, I think it's a perfect record. At this point within the band, they had been exploring a lot more of Fela Kuti's music and started experimenting with more African rhythms and figuring out ways to fuse it with funk and electronic. And the way that a lot of this album was made was that they would do these long extended jams, and then Brian Eno would go back and edit them and splice up parts and add onto it, and then David Byrne would write lyrics on top of that. And this was a very new thing to do at that time, and it was a groundbreaking undertaking, and I think it resulted in one of the best albums of the 80s. The songs are filled with so many tasty and feel-good grooves, but are also very interesting from a music and rhythm perspective as well as a production standpoint. Brian Eno, in my opinion, is doing his best production work up to this point on this album, and this would also unfortunately be the last album that he would produce for the Talking Heads. I also love the addition of the amazing musicians that we have on here, such as King Crimson guitarist Adrian Belew, as well as the amazing trumpet player John Hassel, among others. I also love the contrasting vibe between the first 5 tracks and the final 3 songs. The album starts out on a much more groovy vibe with the opening 5 amazing tracks, with some of Talking Heads' most classic hits like Once in a Lifetime and Houses in Motion, and then the final 3 songs take a detour into that more experimental art rock route with Seen and Not Seen, Listening Wind, and The Overload. The last 2 tracks in particular really changed the mood of the album and ended on a more moody and dark darker vibe, which I love so much. The Overload is my second favorite closing track of any Talking Heads album. It's got such an awesome intensity to it, and I think it's the perfect final track for Brian Eno to leave off on for his production contributions to the Talking Heads. So this album really just does a great job of capturing that very delicate blend of a lot of great things with the very tasteful, groovy, and dancey tracks that are fused with very interesting riffs and uses of electronics and intricate rhythms, but also contrasting that very nicely with the ending chunk of the album, which takes a more moody, darker art rock sort of turn that results in one of the most enjoyable and consistent albums of the entirety of the 80s, in my opinion. So a perfect album, my number one favorite Talking Heads album. This one gets an easy S. Alright, moving on, we have their fifth studio album from 1983 titled Speaking in Tongues, and I will also give this one an S. Another amazing album, and this one goes down as my fourth favorite Talking Heads record, and they've really been on a roll for these past few releases. In between Remain in Light and this album, there had been some different things that went down within members of the group. Brian Eno and David Byrne would record a collaboration album together, and Tina and Chris would go on to form Tom Tom Club, and this is also the first album since More Songs About Buildings and Food to not feature Brian Eno on production. This album gives us some shorter and more poppy songs in comparison to the previous release, and it is very synth and funk heavy, and I think it serves as a great follow-up to Remain in Light, keeping those funky dance elements going, but in a slightly more condensed fashion. This album has 9 tracks, and I think side 1 of this album is pretty much spotless. All 5 songs are amazing. Burning Down the House ended up being the band's only US top 10 hit. Making Flippy Floppy and Girlfriend is Better are 2 perfect, groovy, but also hard-hitting and slightly aggressive Talking Heads tracks. Slippery People is a great vibey song that contrasts the opening 3 songs perfectly, and I Get Wild / Wild Gravity wraps side 1 up with some tasty reggae vibes, which is a really nice change of pace. The only point of contention that I've ever had with this album is that I don't think the opening 2 tracks of side 2 are particularly exciting, with Swamp and Moon Rocks. Not terrible songs, but for me personally, I would say that those 2 are the low point of this album, but the last 2 songs are great, with Pull Up the Roots and This Must Be the Place. This Must Be the Place is an exceptional track and would make my list of top 10 favorite Talking Heads songs, and would definitely go down as my favorite closing track of any Talking Heads album. Just such an incredible song. And although this album does have 2 tracks that I'm not super crazy about, I think the remaining 7 songs are so strong, and this record still sounds and feels like Talking Heads at the top of their game, and produced 2 of my top 10 favorite Talking Heads songs with This Must Be the Place and Girlfriend is Better. And I also think the production still remains very strong even with the absence of Brian Eno, so that's also a very good thing as well, obviously. So another amazing record, my 4th favorite Talking Heads album. This one gets an S. Alright, next we have their 6th studio album from 1985 titled Little Creatures, and I will give this one a B. Not as good as the 5 albums that preceded it, but also not terrible, and for me, it's not their worst album. I think in comparison to everything that came before it, it does feel like a little bit of a dip, but at the same time, I think it does have some redeeming qualities and some good tracks throughout it, and this album actually did very well when it came out. It was at the peak of their popularity after doing the Stop Making Sense tour, as well as the film and album that went along with it, and this actually ended up being their best-selling album, which I've always found fascinating because I think it's clearly not their best album, but just happened to come out at a time where they were in a position to really blow up and capitalize on the big boost in popularity that they had gotten from Stop Making Sense. The album incorporates themes of Americana, and we hear some lap steel and pedal steel guitar on certain tracks, and the songs take on a more straight-ahead pop approach, but I still think a lot of these songs do incorporate some of those more interesting and unpredictable elements that are such a signature to the Talking Heads sound, but maybe just to a lesser degree. We have 9 songs on here, and I would say I enjoy probably around half of the album. I think side 1 is pretty solid with the exception of Perfect World. I think that song is kind of boring. And then for side 2, I like 2 of the 4 songs. I think Walk It Down is fun, and I think the closing track Road to Nowhere is really beautiful, and for me is by far the highlight of this album. So I do think the majority of the tracks on here are enjoyable, but at the same time I don't like any of them as much as as the songs that I really like from the previous 5 albums, so my reasoning for putting it in B tier is more just the fact that I don't think this album contains any standout tracks, with the exception of the closing track, Road to Nowhere. I would say that that is a really amazing song. But in the midst of that, I do think there are some very fun songs on here, and I wouldn't say this is a bad album, just not as strong or as exceptional as a lot of the other stuff that had preceded it. So an okay album, I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 1986 titled True Stories, and unfortunately I'm going to give this one a C. Not one of their better albums in my opinion, and I would say even a downgrade from Little Creatures. This was the soundtrack to a film David Byrne directed of the same title, and stylistically this one is more on the pop rock side. It has 9 tracks, and in general I find the majority of the songs on here pretty flat and uninteresting, and of the few tracks that I do like on here, I wouldn't say that any of them are really exceptional or standout Talking Heads tracks. For me, the strongest song on here by far is Wild Wild Life, which was also the lead single from this album, and for me, that one song is pretty much the saving grace of the record. But I think at this point, a lot of the more exciting and surprising elements that I found so appealing on their previous albums is sadly missing on here, and for me, there is very little about this album that leaves a lasting impression and is memorable in the grand scheme of their discography, and I don't find the replay value very strong either. No matter how many times I try to give this album a chance, it just never grows on me. So unfortunately, this is my least favorite Talking Heads album. This one gets a C. Alright, and lastly, we have their 8th and final studio album from 1988 titled Naked, and I will give this a B. Not a great album, but certainly not a bad album either, and I actually think that this record is a little better than a lot of people give it credit for. I would definitely put it above True Stories and Little Creatures. These songs were written in Paris and were derived from jam sessions featuring additional guests like Johnny Marr from The Smiths, among many others who would also contribute instrumentally to select tracks on the album, and I like the fact that this album revisits some of the elements that we had gotten from the late 70s and early 80s period of their discography, with the return to some more of those art pop, funk, Latin, and Afrobeat elements. And while I wouldn't say that this album has as many exceptional tracks as their earlier works, it definitely has a good chunk of songs that I think are great. With the original CD cassette release, we have 11 tracks, and I really enjoy 6 of the 11 songs on here, so there are definitely some skip-over tracks, but for me, of the 6 songs that I like, I would definitely say that they are all an improvement from True Stories, and I think the quality is slightly higher than the tracks from Little Creatures as well. I think the opening 3 tracks are great, with Blind, Mr. Jones, and Totally Nude. They're all very solid songs and they contrast each other very nicely. A couple of other high points for me are Nothing But Flowers, Big Daddy, and Cool Water. Cool Water is probably my favorite track on here, and I love that they wrap up the album on a track with a more dark and ominous mood, which gives me tastes of a kind of track that could have been on Talking Heads 77. And in general, I would say that this album is a bit darker than the ones that preceded it, and that's another reason why I do like it more. I find it a little bit more interesting. With all that being said, though, it definitely does have a handful of tracks that I could do without, and I do think the album is a tad bit long, and it could have been trimmed down a bit, and that probably would have enhanced it a little bit more. So certainly not their worst release, and I think it's a pretty good album to go out on with a handful of solid Talking Heads songs, but I still wouldn't say it's as strong as any of the first 5 albums. So not the worst final album of their discography. This one will get a B. Alright, so that is it. Those are my personal rankings of their 8 studio albums. There's just so much great music that they put out into the world in a relatively small window of time, being only a little over 10 years in length. And like I said in the beginning, when it comes to late 70s and 80s music, I think it's undeniable that the Talking Heads are one of the most unique musical contributions of that time period, and they've produced some of my favorite records of the late 70s and the 80s. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable and hopefully you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the description and the comments, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And please let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 8 records. I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.